Okay, welcome everybody to our latest webcast. I'm Lester Knutsen with Advanced Data Tools, and I'm going to be talking about best practices for Informix backup recovery and high availability. A lot of material to cover today, both on backups and on HDR. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. There is a chat button on your screen, and if you see that, that's where you can ask questions. Now, I'm not going to see them till the end of the webcast, so you can go ahead and ask them now. I won't answer them right away. With that, let's dive right in. I'm Lester Knutsen. I've been working with Informix since 1983. And all we do is Informix, and this has actually been fun. I've been teaching an advanced Informix course for a group in Malaysia this week. So I've been teaching it on Malaysian time, which means the course starts at 9 p.m. my time, and I stay up all night doing the course. So if I'm a bit groggy today, I apologize. It's because I've been up all night and now all day teaching the other course. But it's a lot of fun, great group I have in the class, a lot of good questions. I really appreciate it. So what I'm going to talk about today are the Informix backup options, logical log backups and why they're important, how you back up an Informix server, how you test backups, and how you set up Informix in a high availability situation. And I'm going to do a couple of demos here. I can switch screens, and I have a little server here called New Server. If I do an onstat-p, you'll see it's been up and running for 21 hours. I just created it, and we're going to use it to back up and restore and do a bunch of tests and actually set up HDR secondary off of this server in the course of this webcast. So I've got slides, but a lot of it's going to be hands-on, where I will show you what I'm doing. So let's talk about the Informix backup options and different scenarios. Sometimes you just want to back up a database, and an Informix server can have multiple databases, and the best tool for that is DB export and DB import. They create ASCII backups of the database, and if your database is large, you're going to have big export files, and that's the one limitation of that. You can back up to tape if you need to with DB export and DB import. The second limitation with DB export and DB import is they lock the database when you're exporting it. And that's so you get a consistent feel for the database, so it's not changing as you're backing it up. It does create ASCII files, so you can take it from one OS to another, and you can even use it to take it to other database systems. Then for table level backup and restore, you have SQL load and unload statements. You have the onload and onunload, which creates binary backups. You have the high performance loader and external tables. And then for restores, you have Archecker. And in the notes at the end of this presentation, I'll have a link out to a paper Mike Walker did on using Archecker to restore one table from a Ontape backup. And then to back up the whole server, you have Ontape and Onbar. Now, SQL load and unload, these are SQL extensions. They're not part of the standard SQL syntax that Informix added to DB Access and ISQL. And it's very simple. You say unload to file name, select whatever from table name. And you can list columns, you can have a where clause. It's super flexible. And then you say load from file name, insert into table name to load the data in. DB export and DB import create ASCII files of the whole database. I'll show you a quick version here. If I just type DB export zip, and I have a zip database on my system, it creates a directory called zip.exp, and that has my little database with 3 tables in it, all unloaded, and the SQL to recreate it. And so I can drop it and just do a DB import on this, and I've got that, the whole database and everything there. Nice, simple, and easy. But it does take disk space, or you can do it to tape. And it does lock the database during the export. Archecker has a version called My Export that doesn't lock the database, and so and it's probably a little bit better for handling large databases. So if you find DB export and import too limiting, do a Google on Archecker's My Export. Now, Onload and Onunload create binary files. I used to use them a lot. I haven't used them in 20 years because they can only be used on the same machine in the same Informix version. They create binary files that are copies of the pages. So the pages are not compressed. They can be fairly large because of that. And if you have empty space in on the page, it's still going to unload the whole page with empty space there. And that's one of the reasons I haven't used it. And it's not portable, but it is a way of unloading a whole database or a table. Now, for the server, you want to look at Onbar and Ontape. And the internal guts of both Onbar and Ontape is exactly the same. One is not better than the other because of the internal guts of it. There are other reasons where, and I have a couple of slides here that will describe them, but they both do a full backup of the whole server and all databases. They both do not lock the server. Users can keep using it. In fact, the reason Informix got the name Online way back in the 80s was it was the first server that you could do a backup while people were using it. This is way back in the old days. Anyway, it has 3 levels of archive. A 0 level is a full system. That means it archives everything. A level 1 will archive only the disk pages that changed since the last 0. So to do a restore with a level 1, you need the 0, and then it will prompt you, do you have a level 1 to restore? A level 2 only does the pages changed since the last 1. And so if time is important, and for all of us time is important, you could do a 0 once a week and then a level 1 every day. Now, the differences between Onbar and Ontape. These are all the things they both do. There's a lot that they both do. Now, some of them, like the encryption, happens in the later versions of 12. That may not be there in your version if you're at 11.5 or something like that. But all of these tasks happen in both Onbar and Ontape. The differences is Onbar uses a storage manager to write the data out. The internal part of Onbar is the same as Ontape. The difference is it connects to a storage manager that takes the output and writes it out. Now, because of that, you can selectively back up certain spaces. And to me, the most important thing is you can do backups in parallel. I've worked with several very large multi-terabyte data warehouses. And the only way you can do a backup in a very large system like that is in parallel to back up many DB spaces at the same time. Ontape does 1 DB space at a time. Ontape is single-threaded. It goes through and starts at the first page on all your DB spaces, and it keeps running until it's finished the last page. Onbar can do DB spaces in parallel, and hence it can take an 8-hour Ontape backup, and if you can back it up to 4 devices at the same time, it could cut that down to about 2 hours. The same thing for restores. You can restore from multiple tape drives at the same time. You can restart a restore. In Ontape, every time you start a restore, you have to start at the beginning. With Onbar, you can start in where you last left off. So basically, Onbar is much better for very large databases where you have a storage manager. Now, the storage manager may cost you extra, depending on what you're using. And there's a lightweight built-in one that comes with Informix. But you can use NetBackup or Tivoli or ComVault or one of the other storage managers out there just as easily. Now, 2 advantages Ontape has is you can change the logging mode for a database using Ontape, and you can also back up to the cloud, and that's a new part in version 12. The source for all this was the IBM Informix Knowledge Center. I've got a link here to that on these slides. And one question that always comes up is, when will the slides be available? And the answer is yes, they'll be available. I'm also recording this session, and probably on Monday we'll have the slides and the YouTube video available for you to look at. So how do you decide? If you have a very large server and you need parallel backups, you want to use Onbar. And if you have a storage manager that backs up everything else, you probably want to use Onbar. I have a number of clients that have storage managers that back up their whole SAN, and so they just use Onbar with that storage manager. Now, you want to use Ontape if you want something simple and easy to set up, and you don't need parallel capabilities. Ontape is very easy, and all the examples I'm going to use today are going to be with Ontape just because it's easier. You can do everything I'm doing today with Onbar. Now, a key point is you don't want to mix Onbar and Ontape. And the reason is, if you do an Onbar backup and then do an Ontape backup, the last backup record that the Informix is going to have is that Ontape backup. So the Onbar backup, which is older, is not going to have all the information you need to restore. Also, you don't want to do Onbar for your logs and then Ontape for your server. You can't restore mixed environments. You have to pick Onbar or Ontape and use just one. And you have to use Onbar and Ontape for both the logs and the whole server. Now, let's talk about logical log backups. This is, I think, really important because the whole purpose of a database is to be able to restore to the last committed transaction. And you can't do that unless you're backing up the logs. It really should say to the last committed transaction on a log that you backed up. If your server crashes and your disk get wiped, you can only recover to the last logical log you backed up. So logical log backups are extremely important. In your onConfig entry, you define how you're going to back up your logical logs if you use Ontape. There are also places for doing this in Onbar. There are 3 basic options. One is if you say dev null, your logical logs will be thrown away. They'll be discarded. They're not backed up. Now, it marks the logs as backed up, so it gives you the illusion that you're backing them up, but it's not. And this is great for development systems where you really don't care about logs, but never use this in a production system. You can put in a tape device, and it will back up to tape. You can also, and this is what I recommend as the best practice nowadays, is to back up to a directory. And that's what I want to show you here. I've created, and this is what I think is the best practice, on my server, a directory called backups. And I have multiple servers on here, so I put a directory in here for each one of my servers. And I have a directory here called new server. That is the name of the Informix server I am running right now. And so if I cd into that directory, you can see I have a directory for logs. And if I do an ls on that, you can see I've got my logs backed up. If I do an on mode -L to change the logical log, got to type it right. And now I do an ls. Whoop. You'll see that I have a new logical log in that directory, logical log number 12. If I do an on mode -L now to change to another logical log, and now look at that directory, I have a new logical log. And that's because I am using the alarm program to automatically back up my logs. And I'm going to show you that in just a minute. So first, let's talk about logging modes. Databases can have basically 3 logging modes. There's no logging, which means transactions are not logged. And this is the equivalent of having a database that you can't do a begin work or a commit work on. There are a few internal transactions that get logged in a no logging database, but basically nothing gets logged. And you can't recover from logs if you have a no logging database. Then you have unbuffered logging and ANSI mode logging. And here, transactions are written to the log when they are committed. So as soon as you do an update and then hit commit, it's written to the log is written to the disk. That's why it's called unbuffered. You also have buffered logging. And here, transactions are written to a logical log buffer in memory and not flushed to disk. Now, 20 years ago, I used to use this a lot because disks were slower and speed was important. Nowadays, most disks are fast enough that unbuffered logging works just fine. And unbuffered logging is the safest. So that's what I recommend folks do. The best practice is to create all your databases with unbuffered logging. So every transaction gets written out to disk. You can back up the logs. And then if you need to, you can recover to the last backed up committed log. There are 2 commands to backup. Ontape -C will do a continuous backup of logical logs. So this runs in a window. Once you type it, it'll continually run. And if your server gets restarted or your Informix gets restarted, you got to remember to restart it. The better option, I think, is Ontape -A. This performs a manual backup of the current log. Now, you do need to look at it and you do need to monitor it, but this is what you can set up to work with the alarm program, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And what happens when you set it up with the alarm program is every time a log is full, the alarm program gets triggered and it causes an Ontape -A to happen. Now, so the best practice is to set up the logical log program with the alarm program, and that's what I've done. And let's take a look at that. So the first thing I want to show you is how I've set this up in the onconfig file. I've got LTape device set to a directory, and that means anytime I issue an ontape -a command or an ontape -c command, it's going to back up the logs to that directory. And so if I look at that directory, I'll see my logs, and it's very nice. It tells me the server they're on. My host name is train14. It tells me the instance number of the server, and it tells me the logs, very clearly labeled. And if I just type ontape -a, it's going to say, do you want to back up the current log? I say yes, and now it's created log number 14 in that directory. Now you have to do it manually. What you want to do is automate it. And so the way to do that is to look at your alarm program that you have in the etc directory. And at the top of the alarm program is a yes/no flag, backup logs, and by default it's no. This is a shell script that IBM provides that you can edit, and you can do all kinds of great stuff with it. So first thing you want to do is change this backup logs to yes. And then a little bit further down will be the command that it uses. And the default command is the command for Onbar. If you're going to use Ontape, you just need to say backup command equal, and then you want to say Ontape -a, and then a -d. And the -d tells Ontape to run as a daemon and not prompt you. So this is being run by a background job. You don't want it prompting. If you leave off the -d, what will actually happen is the alarm program will kick off Ontape, and it'll sit there and wait for you to prompt it. So the -d is very important. Now, this causes the alarm program now to back up the logs. So if I do an onmode -l to change logs, this is the way you test it, by the way. You do an onmode -l, that should change the logs, and now if I look, I should see my new log there. And let's do an onstat -l. This shows me all my logs. My current log is 15. Let's do an onmode -l again. Onstat -l, my current log is now 17. And if I look at that directory, I can see log 16 got backed up into that directory. So that's the best practice. It's to use the alarm program, whether you're using Onbar or Ontape, and have it back up your logs automatically every time a log gets full. Now, if you're backing up to disk, you still need to get the logs off of your server to either a tape device or another server. And that's something that's fairly easy to handle at the Unix level. You could have a cron job that copies it off, looks for any new logs in this directory and copies them to another server, or you could do a tape backup of this directory every so often. What I like best and what we use here is we copy these to an external USB drive, and that way they get copied to an external drive. It's USB, so it's fairly fast, and they're fairly easy to recover from that USB drive when you need them. So here are the steps I went through. And the key step is at the very end, do an onmode -l and see if that happened, that a log backup appears in the directory you set. a couple of key things on the steps is best practice is to always create a directory with your server name in it, so that if you have multiple servers on the box, you can distinguish which server these backups belong to. The permissions have to be 770, and the ownership has to be Informix for all the backup directories involved. Informix does not like backing up, and it will give you an error if the directory is readable by the world, because that means anybody could hack in and do an octal dump and look at your logs. And you, for security, you don't want that. Then you edit the onconfig, you add your Ontape dev to that backup directory, and you want to make sure that it's calling the alarm program. Sometimes people will go in and change the alarm program to another program. That's perfectly fine. If you do that, then you have to edit whatever program gets called to add the log backup to it. And in the alarm program, you want to change backup logs to yes, not no, and you want to add in the backup command so that it will back up things. So that's backing up logical logs. That gets you your transactions. Now let's talk about the whole server backup. First thing is, even though you can use Ontape and Onbar to back up the server, you still need to back up other things. And this is my short list of things that you might need, well, you do need to back up. You need to back up your onconfig file. You need to back up your SQL host file. You need to back up the services, and if you're using HostEquiv or etc host. You need to keep a copy of onstat-d around. If your server crashes and you lose the whole disk where your chunks are, you need to be able to recreate that disk, and you'll need an onstat-d. You'll need a partition map. These are at the Unix device level or logical volume level to see what's there. It's helpful to have DB schemas for your databases, particularly because you'll need the schema if you're going to restore a table using Archecker. And then if you're using Onbar, you'll need the emergency boot file, the IXBAR file. So a level 0 is a full backup. 1 and 2 backs up pages that have changed since the last level. What I really recommend is you do a level 0 whenever possible. If your backup takes less than an hour, do a level 0 every day. It's not until the backups start taking 3 or 4 hours that I recommend doing a level 0 once a week and then a 1 every day. And most very large systems, you can do backups fairly quickly. Now, this is very important, is to make sure you name and label all files with date and time. One of my worst horror stories was as a consultant, I had someone call me up and say, we need some help restoring this Informix server we have here. And so I showed up and said, okay, how can I help? And they handed me a box of unlabeled tapes and said, we don't know what tape to start with. Make sure you label your tapes. The key label for logical logs you need is this number right here, the unique ID, because when you do a restore, it will prompt you for certain unique IDs. That's this number right here at the end of the file if you're doing it this way. Very important to have your backups labeled and your logical log backups labeled. Now, I sat there and there are ways to hack in and try and figure out what's on tapes, and that's what I ended up It took me a couple of days to go through a whole box of tapes and figure out what was on each tape because it was all binary information. But you can do it, and but it's not easy. It's much easier just to label everything so you can find the right stuff to restore. The other point I want to make here while I'm thinking about this, and I do this in the class when I teach it, is practice restores. Nothing is worse than having to do a restore and not having done it before. And I think it's a good idea to practice restores. Now, for Ontape, you set up the tape dev options, and you can have it go to a file. You can have it go to dev null, which means it will reset the internal parameters and not do a backup. Now, that means the server will think you've done a backup, but you haven't. And that can be kind of fun. Now, I think it's a good idea. You can do a backup to a external tape device. You can also back up to a directory, or you can back up to a file. And if you back up to a directory, remember it's going to create a file in that directory with the whole server backup. You're very quickly going to run out of room. I tend to prefer to back up to a file and then copy that file off. So each time I do an Ontape, this file is going to get overwritten. In my little test server here, let's go look at the onconfig. And I have it backing up to a file called newserver.ontape. When you back up to a file, I think this is kind of important. I always use the extension .ontape, so I know this is a Ontape file. And if you're using Onbar, I try and use an extension called .onbar. So I can come over here and get out of this window, do an ls-l, let's go take a look, and there's my backup I did earlier today. So I've got that file backed up, and this is the whole server backed up. Now, couple of key things. Permissions have to be read-write by Informix only. No read-write permissions by the world. That file needs to exist, so you need to touch and create an empty file before you start backups. And then once you've created a backup, you want to use Unix or something else to take it off to another system, or like we do here is copy it to a USB drive. So this is what it looks like when you back up an Informix server to disk. And I'm just going to go ahead and clear the screen, and I'll run it here. Ontape -s. It says, do you want to do a level 0, 1, or 2? I'm going to say a level 0. Now it asks you to mount the tape, even though it's going to a file, and boom, it's done. And it tells me, and this is the key thing, what logical log is on that tape. So from this point on, my other logical logs in that directory, let's see where I am, are not needed because this Ontape backup has log 17, so I can now delete all these earlier logs. If I trigger off another log with an onmode -l command, now that's going to back up another log, I now need that new log. Oh, log 17 is there. I would now need log 17 onward to do a restore. Now, let's talk about restoring Informix. You need to recreate the chunks and devices. You need to recreate, and you don't need to run on DB spaces. You need to have the links there. You need to have everything, logical volumes, your devices all out there. You need to have your onconfig file, your SQL host file, and then you need to do the Ontape restore, and then it will ask you, do you want to restore any logs? So first, restore your Informix dir. If your whole system crashed, that's the first thing you're going to want to do. Make sure you have your onconfig file, your SQL host file. You want to make sure that the services and the host and the names are all the same and all there. So this is all the Unix stuff you need to restore. Then you need to recreate the devices. You not create the DB spaces, but create the links. And on my server, if I do an onstat -d, you can see I have a bunch of cooked files out here, all in Informix chunks, new server. So if I'm going to do a restore, those 4 devices have to be there. They can be empty. If you're doing a restore in another system, you can touch these files and create empty files, but they have to exist for the restore to work. The server must be offline, and then you start the Ontape restore with the Ontape -r command. Now, this is what happens. If everything works well, you'll type an Ontape -r. It will say, okay, mount the tape. Now, I'm doing it from a file, but that's okay. And it will tell you information from reading the header of that file or tape. And the key thing you want to look at here is the archive date will tell you when the archive was made. The archive checkpoint time will tell you when the last checkpoint was. And this is the point in time it will restore to, is to this last checkpoint. Typically, when you do a backup, it does a checkpoint. But I've had systems where Friday afternoon, 5 o'clock, everybody goes home. The last checkpoint happens at 5. Saturday, a backup is done, and no work has happened since the last checkpoint. So it doesn't need to do another checkpoint. And you'll do this and say, wait a minute, it's going to restore me to Friday afternoon, not Saturday when I did the backup. Well, that's because that was the last checkpoint. And it will tell you what devices have to be out there, so you know what it's going to restore. And then it will ask you, do you want to continue the restore? And if you say yes, it will start. If you say no, it will abort, and you can go fix whatever you want. And usually it's to fix these devices. Then it will prompt you, do you want to back up logs? And this is the most confusing prompt out there, and it's very important. And I'm going to describe what it means. It's asking you that, do you want to try and salvage or save any logs that may still exist from your old server? Now, if your server has been completely wiped out, you're going to have no logs to salvage, so you want to say no. If your server, and you want to try and recover to the last minute, you may want to say yes. But when you say yes, stop and think about what it's going to do. Depending on where your L-tape device is set to, and this is the problem I've run into, is if L-tape device is set to a tape device and you're trying to do the restore from the tape device, guess where it's going to write those logs to? It's going to overwrite your tape device. And suddenly your restore will be gone. So key point here is always write protect your tapes before you start a restore. If there is a separate L-tape device, and it's not dev null. If it's dev null, it will also try and overwrite wherever you're trying to do a restore from. And I've had several classes where we'll get to this restore part, and I call it you failed to restore if you say yes here, and it overwrites your restore. I think it's always a good idea, and you'll see that I've done this. Where am I? I'm in the directory one. Is to make a copy before you do a restore of your Ontape. So what I would do is before you start the restore, make a copy and call it save to. So that way you know you have a saved copy of your backup in case it gets overwritten. Then what happens is it just sits here. And if your backup took 8 hours, it's going to sit here at this prompt for 8 hours, and you're not going to know what's happening. This is the most nerve-wracking time because you know it, well, you think it's backing up, but it's not telling you. Back in the old days, when we used to restore from tape drives, you could at least see the tape drive working. Nowadays, you can't see that. And so it can be very nerve-wracking. And it's very important to test your restores so you know how long it's going to take. And if the backups take 8 hours, the restore is going to take at least 8 hours, if not longer. And after it's finished, and I'm going to show you a trick in just a minute on how to check your restores and see the progress. But after it's finished, it will prompt you, do you have a level 1 to restore? And then it will prompt you, do you have log tapes to restore? And then you're up in quiescent mode. So here's a list of the prompts. Let me do a demo of a restore. Now, to do a restore, your server has to be down. So if I type ontape -R, hit return, it's going to say, do you really want to do this? Because your server is up. I'm going to say yes. And it's going to say it failed. It can't do a warm restore. You have to shut down the server. Now, if you shut down the server, you can do a restore, and this is where you need to be careful. If you're on a production system, it's going to overwrite your production server there. So I do an ontape -R, hit yes. It says, do you want to continue the restore? I say yes. Do you want to back up the logs? No, I haven't changed any logs, so I'm going to say no. And if you do, this is where you want to be very careful about what it's going to do. Now look, it just sits there, and it's going to sit there until it's done. How do you tell what's going on? And I'm going to show you my little trick. I should have had a second window open for this. Oh, it's finished. The trick, though, is to do an onstat -D, and actually here it will tell you, add up the number of pages minus the free pages, and that will tell you how many pages it's got to restore. So take this column, the size, minus the free, and that will tell you how many pages have to be restored. So on the root DB space, I have about, what's that, about 60,000 pages that have to be restored. And then what you do in your other window is you do an onstat -D, and you can watch it write pages out. And that will give you an idea of how many pages it is restoring. And the way I've found to estimate how long a restore is going to take is I'll sit there and time this for 10 minutes and calculate then how many pages is it writing per minute. And that will give you a very good ballpark on how long the restore is going to take. I want to tell you a story. I had a client, multi-terabyte database. It took 8 hours to back it up. They did a level 0 once a week. They were doing a restore, and they had not tested the restore in ages. And we'd expected it would take 8 or 10 hours to do the restore. After 10 hours, it still hadn't finished. And so at that point, they got me involved, and I sat here and did some math, calculated how many pages had to be restored, and then I calculated how many pages per minute it was restoring. And I came back and said, based on what's happening, this is going to take 36 hours to restore. What they had not tested and didn't know was the SAN people had changed something in the SAN network, and the Ontape was not affected. The backup was not affected, but it affected the restore. And it just took way slower than it should have. So you've got to look for things like that. Again, calculate how many pages are used. So you take size minus free pages, and then calculate with an onstat minus capital D how many pages it's writing, and that will give you an idea of what has to happen with the restore. Now, it says, do you have a level 1? I'm going to say no. Do you want to restore logs? I'm going to say no. After the restore is done, it comes up in quiescent mode. And you can, in your other window, do an onstat minus M and watch it come up in recovery mode. You can see it goes here into recovery mode, and once it's up and running, it's in quiescent mode. You need to, this gives you a chance to check things before you bring it into multi-user mode. And then it's up and running, and you've got your server back online, and your users can connect to it. So that's a restore. Now, I want to talk about 2 other kinds of backups just because they're there and they can be very useful. One is backing up to STDIO, standard input, standard output. STDIO is a Unix term, and it means standard output. And usually you use a pipe to output the standard output, and this kind of pipe to input from standard input. And Ontape with the keyword STDIO can do a backup to a pipe. Now, when you do this, you don't get any prompts. And it was interesting, I'm seeing a discussion on the Informix mailing list from someone who's using this, and what he's not, because you're not getting prompts, you're also not seeing any error messages. And so I think he's having problems because he's not seeing error messages or prompts when you do this. So you've got to make sure it works. To back up, you do an Ontape minus S, a minus L0, a minus T tells it the device, and if you say STDIO, and if you stop right there, it's going to come to your screen. You'll have the whole contents of your backup go streaming to your screen. What you want to do is output it to a file. And then to read from the file, you just do an Ontape minus R minus T, STDIO, direct the input from that file, and that will do the restore. Where this is really helpful is it allows you to zip up your backups and encrypt them. I'm a big fan of encrypting backups if you can. We've been in business for over 25 years, and I have boxes of old tapes here that I have to pay money to degas because they're not encrypted. And it's a real pain. You want to encrypt things. If I'd been encrypting my old tapes, I wouldn't have to worry about this. The second thing that Informix can do is external backups. And you've got to be very careful about this. This is when you want to use a non-Informix program to back up your data. And the very simple example is, I have all these chunks out here. Why can't I use tar to back them up? The answer is you can, but you have to be very careful to make sure that all the data structures in memory are synced to disk when you do that. If you don't, you're running a gamble on whether it will work. And my favorite example is I was working with a client doing SAN cloning. And they kept saying, oh, we can just clone the Informix disk with the SAN. And I kept saying, no, you need to do an external backup so Informix knows that everything is quiescent. And they said, no, the SAN will take care of it. Well, we tested it 10 times, and it worked every time, just like they said. And they said, okay, Lester, you're wrong. 2 years later, they call me up and say, Lester, we can't do the restore from this backup. And, you know, it worked fine in their testing. This is why I say it's a gamble. If you don't do the external backup right, it may not work when you try and restore it, and you really don't know. If all the data was synced to disk, then it will work. If anything was in memory and not synced to disk, it won't work. So the steps to do an external backup are to block the Informix server. Now, people don't like to do this because this stops everything. And you issue an onmode -C block command. Now, if your external backup is quick, it's not a problem. People can still do selects. They can't do updates when you block the server like this. You do your external backup, and then you unblock the server. This way you know that everything between the block and the unblock is committed to disk. This first block actually will commit everything to disk, so it's there for your external backup. So it's very important to synchronize the data structures, and then this works. And then you can use your SAN. The scenario I see is people will use their SAN, and all they have to do here is break the mirroring on the SAN, which takes a second, and then they'll back it up on the SAN, and it's not mirrored, so it's okay, but they blocked it, broke the mirroring, unblocked it, Informix keeps going, and then after they've finished their backup on the SAN, they resynchronize the disk. Now, very important to test your backups. I've got all kinds of horror stories about clients who have not tested backups. We had one client who every day did a backup, never tested their backups. And one time when they needed to do a restore, they discovered their tape drive had not been working. And their tape drive had been happily writing out to tape, but something had been misaligned and it didn't work. And it had not really saved. It looked like it was saving. It told you it was saving. It had not saved data, and you couldn't read the backups. My favorite way is to actually do a restore on another machine, a test machine. If you do a backup once a week, take it over to a test machine and do a restore. I was working with a university last year. That was great. They recreated their test environment from production, and it was also testing their backups continually. And it was really good, very sharp set of DBAs there in putting that together. Now, besides doing a restore, Informix has a program called Archecker that will allow you to test a backup. It will read the backup, doesn't write anything, doesn't do a restore. You can run it on a different machine because it is, if your backup took 8 hours, the Archecker is going to take at least 8 hours to read your backup. So you can move it over to a development machine or a test machine if you want to. And also in Archecker is the ability to restore a specific table from the backup if you want to get one table back. There is a configuration file that you need if you're going to run Archecker on another machine. But if you're running it on the machine that the backup was made on, you don't need it. This is all you need. And I'm going to open up a window here. I'm going to run Archecker, and it's going to go and it says, okay, here's the backup device. I'm going to see if it's right. Press enter to continue. I'm going to press enter, and look at it. It checked all my tables. It basically goes through and reads every page, every table, and at the end, you'll see if it passed and the number of tables and fragments that it validated, and then if the Archecker passed. That's what you want to see. You know your backup's good then. My client who had the tape drive go bad, if they had been doing this, they would have found that out almost immediately when the tape drive went bad. So this is sort of what Archecker gives you, and what you want to see is it passed, how many tables, fragments it validated, and the whole server passed. So the last part of this is high availability. And Informix has multiple kinds of replication. I'm only going to talk about high availability, HDR for short. And HDR allows you to set up a clone of your production system and have it continually getting log records from your production system so it's ready to take over if your production system goes down. This is the best kind of insurance you can have. And the great news right now with Informix licensing is you can have, with your production license, a HDR secondary at no extra cost as long as you don't use it for anything. If you start doing queries on it, then you got to pay a license fee there. But if your primary fails and you need to use it, the license from the primary then transfers to the secondary. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Let me mention, though, the other kinds of replication Informix has. Enterprise replication is flexible replication. It's much harder to configure, but you can replicate down to a field, a table, a column, a where clause. You have shared disk cluster replication. This is where you have several servers sharing one disk. You have continuous log restoration. That's when you have a second server that is always restoring in restore mode until you need it. And then the last, you have flexible grid. Now, I'm going to focus on replication for disaster recovery. And what you want here is a primary server and a secondary server. It's very simple to set up, and we're going to do it right now. In fact, in the next 10 minutes, we'll have a second server set up. It's very easy to administer. The second server is in read-only mode, so you can use it, but you got to pay license for it. That's the only thing. And it works with all the other Informix replication solutions. It's very easy to set up, and this has been part of the product since version 7, since the 90s. It's very stable and rock solid. Now, I have a number of clients where the network is not fast enough to keep up with the primary. And if that's the case, you want to look at using RSS, a remote secondary. And what the way to think about the difference, a secondary, every time you commit a transaction on the primary, it has to commit on the secondary. A remote secondary doesn't. It can handle the delay. And we had one client we're working with where they had two servers side by side in the same data center. Primary, secondary, worked great. They moved the secondary to another city, and the network bandwidth, because they had so many transactions, was not fast enough to handle it. All they had to do was set it up as a remote secondary, and then it could handle the delay. I'm not going to talk about setting that up now, but it's very similar to what we're doing here with setting up a primary and a secondary. Enterprise replication is flexible. This allows you to replicate any direction. You can replicate fields. You can replicate columns. You can replicate where clauses. One scenario I used was I worked with a client that had 80 sites. We had a master customer file, and that got replicated out to each of the 80 sites, but only their customers got replicated. And then the sites replicated back their daily transactions to the master. So the primary site had all the transactions. It's very flexible how you want to set up enterprise replication. The third kind of replication Informix has is shared disk secondaries. This is where you have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 servers, one primary and the others secondaries, all sharing the same disk. It's like Oracle Rack for Informix, and it works great. It's fairly easy to set up. So let's talk about setting up, though, high availability replication, and I want to show you how easy it is. And it's so easy, I really think everybody should be doing this. Even if you're just replicating to another server in your same data center. But most people have an offsite. We actually host a couple of offsite servers for people doing HDR, and we have that. So what you want to do is create a chart, and you're going to have a primary and a secondary. The secondary has to be a clone of the primary. You want to create your Informix server names, and I'm calling my primary new server. I'm going to call my secondary new server S. Now, I've had people do east and west, A and B, 1 and 2, whatever you want. Calling one primary and one secondary, one reason not to do that is you may need to switch. And if the primary goes down, the secondary needs to become the primary. So I do like things like 1 and 2 or east and west as a way to keep track of it. We're going to set these up. My primary is on train 14. My secondary is going to be on train 11. And here are the steps. We're going to set up the environment on both servers. So let me log in. And I'm on train 14 here. And I'm set up for new server. And this is train 11. And let's just look at the environment. And this is new server STCP. I'm using the network protocol. You want to set up trusted communications. If the two servers are not trusted, this will not work. And there are a number of ways to do it. You can use rhost, which is the Unix way of establishing trust. The way I'm going to show you is to use a onConfig variable called remote server config and give it the name of a file that establishes trust. But this is basically what you want to do. On the secondary, you want to be able to go into DB Access and connect to your primary without a username and a password, just hitting return there. If you can do that, you know you've got trusted host working. So let me go to the primary and VI my onConfig file. and I'll show you what I did here. So the in your on config, and this is not in the earlier version. So if you don't have this in your on config, that just means it's not supported in your version. I have an environment file that says, okay, give me the name of a file that's going to have the trusted host. And I called it rhost. You could call it anything you want. That file has to live in the Informix etc directory. So if I vi opt Informix etc rhost, this is a file, and all it does is say the user Informix on train 14 and the user Informix on train 11 are both trusted. It's very simple. Another utility you can use if you don't want, and that file has no passwords, by the way. Informix has a new utility that you can also use called onPassword that will generate encrypted files with passwords that you can put on the server, again, in the etc directory. And that's another way of doing this. So you have several options of setting up trusted communications. The third thing you have to do is, and this is important for RSS servers, so I typically do it for everything, is in your on config, add a log index bills 1. What that does is it tells Informix to log index bills and send over the index page by page. You don't need it for a primary and a secondary. You do need it for RSS, and so I tend to just put it in all the time. And it's just an on-config setting. Then you want to do an Ontape backup. So I'm going to do an Ontape -s, level 0, return. I've got my backup. And now I can start the primary server. Now you notice I haven't done anything yet here on the secondary. So I'm going to issue the onmode command, onmode -d, primary, and I'm going to then tell it what the secondary is. Whoops, did I type that wrong? And so now, if I look at my onstat minus, it says it's online, that this is a primary. If I look at my message log, it's trying to connect to that server, but it can't. And it's telling me that it cannot connect to that server because I haven't set it up. So let's go to the secondary, which is train 11. And the first thing I want to do here on the secondary is I've got the environment set up. I copied the on config over, and that's the easiest way to do it. I've added it to the SQL host file. So let's just cat $informix dir etc SQL host. And so I've got my primary in there and I've got my secondary in there. I've copied over the on config. And in the on config, I need to change tape dev to point to wherever I'm going to put that file. I need to change the server name to be new server S, and I need to change the alias to be the network version of that server. And then I need to copy the file over from the server. So let's go to the backup directory. I'm right there. SCP train 14 / home Informix backups new server dot Ontape, and put it right here. It's asking me for the password on the other machine. And now I've got that backup right here on this machine. Now, before I go in to start fast recovery, you need to make sure that the devices are there. So I've done this before, so I know they're there, but I've got my empty devices there. So now I can start an Ontape -P. And you notice I do a P instead of an R. The P tells it to do a physical restore, and that allows it then to do a separate logical log restore. I'm going to say yes, continue the restore, don't back up the logs. And again, I'm sitting here while it's doing the restore. I don't know what's happening. Do I have a level 1 to restore? I don't, but if I did, you would have to do that. And now it's stopped, and I'm in fast recovery mode. It stays in fast recovery mode. So what you want to do now is issue the command to change it to the primary. And it's an onmode -D command, and you want to make this one the secondary and tell it that the new primary is new server. Onmode -D, secondary, and the primary is new server. Sorry, new server TCP. Now, it says I'm the secondary, but I'm still in fast recovery. If you do an onstat -N, you can see that it's starting to catch up. So it's going out that two servers are talking to each other now. Onstat -M here. It's talking, and this one is online, and it's the primary. And let's see if it's caught up yet. It takes a few minutes. It's in read only, and it's a secondary. So now I have HDR replication working. Any committed transaction on the primary is going to get replicated to the secondary. So let's go here on the primary and create a new database. And I'm going to create a database called LK, put it in the data DB space. I'm going to have it logged and just hit escape and say create new database. Come over here on the secondary, go into DB access, query language, and there is new database. My new database is right there, but there are no tables in it. If I go to info, it says there are no tables. So let's come over here on the primary and let us go to table and create a table called LK test. And I'm going to add a column 1. I'm just going to be very simple and say call 1, type, let's make it serial, length 1, I'm going to say call 2, let's make that character, and we'll make it 20, and it's not unique. And now let's go exit and create this table. Now if I go into my other window, hit info, it's not replicated yet. Let me close this database, select another database, and now let's go back and select the LK one. It's not replicating. What did I do wrong? Did I not create the database with, oh. I didn't save the database, I guess. I didn't really create. Let's do a commit. LK test is there. Now I hadn't committed it. That was the problem. Once it's committed, it will be over there on the secondary. So that's my little ER demo. I could spend hours on this. In fact, we have part of our course a couple of weeks ago. I did a intro to new Informix DBAs, and if the students are all really good and sharp, I add a extra lab on setting up HDR like this, and we did that last week, and it was a lot of fun. So what I'm going to do is pause right now in just a minute and take questions. Let me actually finish the slides, and I'll take questions at the end. If you have any questions, open up the chat, and I'll get to questions in just a minute. Before I get to questions, though, I want to mention the next webcast is I'm going to do one on the OnConfig Part 2 of the one I started a couple of months ago and ran out of time. And then in June, Tom Beatty is going to do one on the Informix Connection Manager. This is the other part of HDR that's very important, because when you have a primary and secondary, if you're using Connection Manager, your users can automatically fail over to the primary and secondary. And Tom will talk about that and many other uses for Connection Manager in the next webcast. Mike will talk about auditing in July, and trust me, we have more things in the works for the rest of the year. We'll do one a month. I want to point out that the International Informix User Group Conference is happening next week. If you're there, look me up. I'll be there. I have 3 sessions. Tom and Mike and Archecker are all going to be there. We all have sessions we're doing. And also just mention that we have a couple of courses still. We have one in July, which is the advanced course that Art and I do together. Art and I are teaching this course this week for the group in Malaysia, and it's a lot of fun. If you're an experienced Informix DBA and you want to improve your skills to the next level, this is the course to take. And then in September, I'll do the intro course for new Informix DBAs. Most of the people in my classes, it's kind of fun, are not really new, but a lot of them are Oracle DBAs. It's a lot of fun seeing what happens. And as long as we have one student registered, we'll teach the class. Now, that's usually not the problem. The problem is usually our classes fill up. And there's a question on versions and I don't know the answer to this. It's what version can IFX Onbar back up to disk? I actually think that's there from the beginning, but you cannot use like net backup. You have to use the built-in storage manager. I know that's in the version 12 that fits there now. So sorry, I don't know the exact version when that changed. Any other questions? Well, cool. This has been fun. If you do have questions, feel free to drop me an email. I travel a lot, and I work. I'm often on site. I'm actually next week for the next 3 weeks going to be on the road, so I may not respond right away, but I try and respond as soon as I can. And I want to thank everybody for attending this webcast, and look forward to seeing you on one of the future webcasts. Have a good day, and goodbye now.